Hello, I'm Ed Sardella. For the next hour, we're going to celebrate excellence, the nationally recognized excellence of the Lakewood Police Department. The department has a history of more than 40 years, and in that time, more than 65 Lakewood officers have gone on to be chiefs, sheriffs, and law enforcement executives in Colorado and across the country, an extraordinary record for a city of Lakewood's size. What is it about this department that has developed so many strong leaders? We're going to explore that question with 6 police chiefs in Colorado. Let's meet them in the chronological order of their service in Lakewood. Clint Blackhurst, chief of the Brighton Police Department, who joined the Lakewood Police Force, although it wasn't called that then, shortly after its inception in 1970. Jerry Garner, the chief in Greeley. John Patterson, Cherry Hills Village Police Chief and City Manager. Dan Brennan, chief in Wheat Ridge. John Camper, the police chief in Grand Junction, and the current Lakewood Police Chief, Kevin Paletta. Chief Paletta, let's begin with you. The history and the background and the personality of the Lakewood Police Department dates back to when the city and the police department were formed in 1970. What was going on at that time nationally and worldwide, as well as in the region, that prompted some of the philosophical decisions about the department?
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate the opportunity. I didn't start with Lakewood until 1981. But I think it's important for anybody viewing this video to understand that this was a different era in our culture and in law enforcement in the late 1960s and early 1970s when the city of Lakewood, and in particular the Lakewood Police Department, were formed. There was a lot of social unrest. Law enforcement did not have a very professional reputation. There was abuses of power, there was corruption, there was excessive force, and the police didn't have the trust of the community like they really should and needed. And about that same time, the President Johnston ordered the Congress to study a commission on finding out what we could do to improve law enforcement and policing in the United States. And right at that time, the city of Lakewood annexed, incorporated. It was the largest incorporation of its time, 90,000 people all at once. And the city of Lakewood started with a brand new policing concept based upon the recommendations from that President's Commission. So I think it's important to understand that out of those changes in society came a new era in policing.
In introducing that concept, there's an interesting quote. Mayor Ritchie, Jim Ritchie, the first mayor of Lakewood, indicated that he would not have seriously considered running for mayor if it had been an existing city. But because it was a new city, it gave him the opportunity to innovate, to create, to take the commission's report and put it into activity. So Chief Blackhurst, you arrived shortly after the city was formed. What were some of these unusual and innovative things that Lakewood introduced, and how did they work out?
Well, as Chief Paletta mentioned about the President Johnston's task force, in fact, when I first came aboard, which is October 1970, the police department had been on the street, so to speak, as a police department since I think about June or July of that year. We were actually issued copies of that President's Task Force report as part of our books that we were given, the code books and other things, but you're actually given a copy and everyone's expected to read that. And we knew right away, of course, the title at that time was the Lakewood Department of Public Safety. That was some of the titles are all different. We were not called police officers, they were police agents.
What was the reason for that?
Well, I think, again, to kind of break with the tradition, the one law enforcement agency at that time that really had the respect and admiration of and the trust of the general public was the FBI. Mm-hmm. And they were all college educated, everyone knew that, and they called them agents. And so I think to a degree they kind of mimicked some of the respect or tried to get that kind of professionalism that the FBI had enjoyed for so many years. And I think that was the beginning. It started with the uniform. Everyone talks about the significance of the uniform because it was the most visible thing.
And I wore my blue blazer.
That's right. I think some of us wore the blue shirts. And that was really the most visible outward sign was no badge. Your weapon, we did have weapons, but a lot of the other agencies actually would spread the rumor that we really didn't carry guns. Well, we did, but they were actually hidden from view because of the blazer. You're required to wear the blazer at all times. We had gray slacks, a powder blue shirt, and the dark blue blazer with the patch, the Lakewood police patch, and that was the only visible outward distinction that you were a police officer.
This was a direct result of the Commission's recommendations. The Commission, as well as Mayor Ritchie, wanted what I guess is a warm and fuzzy police department, and the thought at the time was to create a relationship or a partnership between the public and the police.
I think the whole concept was a little deeper. I think they were looking for education, a broader perspective. They were looking for not just a warm and fuzzy, but an outward visible approach of being very professional and all that entailed. And so the big emphasis when we first came here again was training, even though we were way understaffed for the size of the population. Training was an integral part of the department right from the very beginning. And it was management training and concept training, but right from the beginning, the emphasis was on we want to do things the very best.
All right, let's bring some of the other chiefs involved in the discussion. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Ed, if I could sort of build on what Clinton and Kevin were talking about. I saw Jim Ritchie as a transformational leader. I mean, he really took a risk, I think, in implementing the Commission's report. Lakewood had a very non-traditional rank structure here, and the fact that they went for just college-educated police officers was not evolutionary, that was revolutionary at the time. And many of us came from departments where we were sort of pariahs where we were because we had college degrees. And I think that drew many of a certain type of individual to Lakewood. We were very excited about the action that was going on here, the changes occurring in policing. So I give a lot of credit to Mr. Lynch, Chief Lynch and Mayor Jim Ritchie at the time for what they did. They took a huge risk. And there were some really great people. This is a very exciting place to come to in the mid-'70s when I started here.
I want to talk about, you mentioned Chief Lynch. I want to talk about the Chief Lynch and the chief that succeeded him, Pierce Brooks, and particularly bring the rest of you into the discussion because those two really established the legacy and established the rules of order, if you will, about how the department was going to conduct itself, and yet they were, in a lot of ways, philosophically opposite, if not diverse, or the other way around, diverse if not opposite.
Yes, very much so. Chief Lynch was huge risk taker, very much outside the box, non-traditional. And I think Clinton and Jerry can talk to this, but we tried a lot of things early on that didn't work. You know, the non-traditional rank structure. They tried some team policing early on, which I think we've sort of come back to now. Pierce Brooks, when Chief Brooks came in, he brought, in my mind, structure to the department, professionalism. I mean, he set a lot of the processes in place. And he was an absolute authoritarian, where Lynch was much more open and freewheeling. Mr. Brooks was a police officer's police officer. Came out of LAPD. He's still a legend inside the police department.
I want to talk more about him in just a minute, but let's bring Chief Brennan and Chief Camper into the discussion. You came, Chief Brennan, in 1977, and Chief Camper, you came in '81. To what degree did the legacy of Jim Ritchie and Lynch and Pierce Brooks, how much of that survived during your years when you came to the department?
Well, you know, I remember when I got here, Chief Brooks had just departed, and as new recruit, you know, what struck me about him was the structure he brought to the organization, and also the concept of officer safety. He was the author of a book, Officer Down Code 3, and I could remember that the concepts that were in that book were really drilled into us throughout that academy, you know, experience. The policies and procedures, you know, the structure that he brought were I think, critical to the organization's success. The thing that I most remember about Mayor Ritchie was he loved his police department. He loved cops. And I think it says a lot about, you know, his vision and the vision of those early leaders in Lakewood, that their most important task, their first task that they wanted to get complete, was starting up the best professional police department in the United States. It wasn't hiring a city manager, it wasn't doing some of the other things that you see with startup cities. It was, let's get the best police department we can get on board. Public safety was their #1 priority in 1969, and I think it's still the #1 priority today.
And what influence was left in 1981? We're talking about 11 years later. What did you experience from left over from those early years?
Sure. Well, I think, yeah, by 1981, I think it was the legend, but there was some real meat to it from the standpoint of standards. You know, Dan talked about policy and procedure and so forth. He's absolutely correct, but I think the legend for me, by the time I got there, the same year that Kevin did in 1981, was the standards that were set. It'd be too strong to say that we lived in fear, because we didn't. It was a great place to work and still is, but we certainly had a healthy respect for the fact that you maintain the standards of integrity and conduct, and if you didn't, there was going to be hell to pay.
So that survived over the first 11 years of the department.
And you know, one thing that was sort of new to policing at the time was our internal affairs standards. We would take a complaint, Lakewood Police Department, Lakewood Department of Public Safety would take a complaint from anybody at any time for anything. So the irony was, if an intoxicated person, a drunk, comes in at midnight and wants to file a complaint against a Lakewood police agent, we would take it. And that was considered revolutionary at the time. Other departments would ridicule us for taking complaints in those situations. But I think it really spoke to how driven we were, how driven the forefathers were in making sure this was a professional agency.
All right. Chief Blackhurst, let's come back to, briefly, let's come back to Pierce Brooks, because as you mentioned, he is a legend. A couple of the interesting things that I read in a book, which I'm going to reference here in just a minute, was that he used a different colored ink, and you didn't want to get a memo in that color ink. Neither did you want to go into the office necessarily under certain circumstances. Tell me about his leadership style.
Well, I'll get back one time to Ron Lynch was only here for about probably a total of a year, and actually for only about 6 months before he was let go. And the question is obvious: why do we think he was instrumental in influencing the department over that short period of time? But one thing we have to remember, he was the one that hired the core group of individuals that lasted all the way into the 70s and 80s. And he was responsible for bringing John Vermillion with him, and for many of the other leaders that who became hired chief under Ron Lynch.
Right.
The biggest difference, I mean, to point out the difference between the two, Ron always insisted, or Chief Lynch insisted, that you call him Ron by his first name. And I'm sure all these gentlemen can relate. If you ever even thought about calling Pierce Brooks by his first name, that was a death sentence. But when he first got here, to show you the difference again, we noticed that he would sign his name, and all of his little scribblings was in green ink, and that green ink become legend. You're not allowed to use green ink. No one else in the department, if they even thought about having a green pen, that was a death sentence right there. And so we looked for the green ink, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
I remember one of the first officers that left, George Johnston, which is another story. But anyway, George left to become a chief in North Carolina. And I went back for a conference back there and visited him. And I noticed that he had picked up the habit of signing in green ink. He later came back to Lakewood. I thought if Pierce knew that, he'd be angry. But some of us had the opportunity to go in to the chief's office, and that was not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
And I was only in there a couple of times, and they were both times that I was nodding, yes sir, yes sir, yes sir. It wasn't a two-way conversation.
Yes.
He would take his glasses off, and he would set them down on the table, and he'd give you that look, and your heart about stopped, because he wasn't a very big man, and I think Kevin met him later and was kind of expecting a large, dominating figure, and in fact he wasn't, but he certainly carried the aura about him.
Even for people of my generation who had nothing to do with police departments, he was a legend even with us, because he was a technical advisor on Dragnet, and that was during my generation. And I guess he reflected a lot of Joe Friday's personality, didn't he?
He definitely did.
There was something
Facts,
similar.
ma'am.
And Adam 12 for the younger generation, he was also a technical advisor there as well. What did he leave behind for the younger police chiefs? What did he leave behind that has influenced you in terms of your being a chief?
Again, I have to go back to the standards, that it's okay to have high standards. It's okay to hold people to those standards, and in fact, it's critical to running a good police department. And so the standards from one standpoint, innovation, letting people try new things, in fact, expecting it, demanding it. There's an obligation for us to innovate. And
you know, I picked up on that right away when I came in 1981, and it stayed with me my entire career, as it did all of these guys.
We talked about at the beginning of the program that at least 65 of you have gone from being an officer in the Lakewood Police Department to chiefs and executives in law enforcement. And was that part of the reason you think that Lakewood has produced so many leaders?
Well, the expectation was, I think at Lakewood from very early on, that we want you to excel, do the best you can possibly do, and move on to being head of an organization. In fact, early on, we were being told, if you stay here for more than 5 years, maybe something's wrong with you. You should be getting out of here. Well, the department realized over the years that if you're turning your department over every 5 years, that's not going to work very well, because you need experience here too. But that, especially early on, was, well, get your experience and then move on, because we think you're a leader. But Brooks in particular did encourage you to excel, to try some different things. But one of the things I think Brooks brought here that's been very helpful to Lakewood over the years, he took the idealism that we had very early on, and he had extremely high standards, but he also, from his experience in LA, had the benefits of traditional police work, common sense police work. For example, one of the things that was tried early on is, let's don't have an investigation division. We don't need detectives. Patrol officers or agents can follow up all their own crimes by themselves. Well, Brooks realized this isn't practical. There's new cases coming in all the time. Patrol officers can't do that. So he did something like form an investigations unit. And he brought that practical experience from LA here. And that helped us a huge bunch.
He was a superlative detective. And between the years 1973 and 1976, Lakewood did not hire brand new officers. They hired just laterals. And I think it was part of his plan.
Tell us what a lateral is.
A lateral is a police officer who has a minimum of 3 years experience with another police department. And that was new about Lakewood too, where Lakewood actually hired lateral police officers who had experience and brought them in at an elevated pay. Something else Lakewood did early on, I think that was key to many of us moving on, was they had a portable pension plan. We went to a money purchase plan in 1977, where if you became vested in 5 years, it's not like Denver where you have to stay 20 years. Lakewood police agents could stay for 5 years, and then they get an opportunity to move on to another department, and that money went with them. So I think the fact that we had 4-year degrees, very upwardly mobile individuals, ambitious, you had a money purchase plan, and you had these great standards that were here that all these fellows took with them where they went elsewhere. In fact, all the guys around this room, I think, are superlative detectives. That's what Brooks brought to this police department. He brought in guys like Ron Beckham, and he brought in some guys from Miami-Dade who headed up our crime investigations unit. We were a very, very good police department after Mr. Brooks was here.
The legacy of the Blue Blazers and everything that went with it, as well as the college education and so on, the standards that you've already talked about, really created some problems for you with other police departments who are a lot more traditional, and that extended even after the Blue Blazer went away. So let's talk about that a little bit. What was the problem? Cops didn't want to see you wearing blue blazers, I suppose, and neither did the public, as it turned out, right?
Well, it was something different, and that was even something that caused a small little group in the community in the late 70s to advertise, we want to do away with the police department. We want the sheriff's office to take over the area because children don't know what cops look like in Lakewood because they wear these silly looking outfits. We want people to know what our policemen are supposed to be. Well, that push never went anywhere. There was never any real danger the department was going to be disbanded. But if you were working here at the time, that was upsetting, knowing that the whole department might be without a job somewhere down the road. So that was one thing that the Blazer did for us, as silly as it may sound, that wasn't very good for the department. It wasn't a practical uniform to start with. It was never a practical uniform. But it took us several years to realize that and get rid of it. And that was one of the things that set us apart that did make those relations with some of the other agencies kind of rough in the early days. Plus, we had the college degree, and that was unusual also.
Let's expand on that a little bit. Much of what we're talking about here is taken from a book called A Celebration of Excellence, which is the Lakewood Police Department's 40-year history from 1970 until 2010. And The book makes a couple of references to the Blue Blazers. One said, "You look like a door-to-door salesman." And another one, there was another quote that said, "It looks better on a yacht than it does in a police beat." How did that, to a large degree, I guess, the differences that we've talked about with the Lakewood Police Department carried over for a number of years, even after a lot of them were revised? Tell me about that, particularly in terms of relationships with Denver, among other police departments in the metro area. What kind of problems did that cause?
Well, just a quick comment on that. I think it's a natural source for animosity that an agency would come in and say the previous model for policing isn't working and we're going to do it better and differently. And all of a sudden you're surrounded by agencies that have always done it this way before, and I don't think it endeared us to these other law enforcement agencies to say we're going to do it better, we're going to do it differently here at Lakewood. So I think there was a sense of, well, let's just see, Lakewood, let's see how good you really are. We wanted to be an elite police department without being elitist. I don't know that we always succeeded in that regard, and I think sometimes maybe there was a sense that we were elitist, and we were sometimes our own worst enemy.
Plus, at the same time, we have to remember, again, history, Wheat Ridge Incorporated, almost exactly the same time as Lakewood did, and they chose to go the opposite route. Mm-hmm. They had, the majority of their staff, including their chief, was all prior sheriff department personnel from Jefferson County. So they provided this total contrast in organization and philosophy. And they were right next door. And then we had Lakewood, who had policemen coming in from all around the country with these college degree and believing, as Kevin has said, and the rest of the panel. So I think there was that stark contrast between the two organizations that people also looked at.
There was a fun element of establishing a new city and a new police department. And one of the things that surprised me in reading the write-ups in the book was that because Lakewood was a new city, there were a lot of maps in existence that didn't have Lakewood on it. And as one of you pointed out, a lot of the officers were from out of town, and so both the officers and the dispatchers really didn't know where everybody was. And that created some problems, didn't it?
I think I left Lakewood 30 years after I started and still didn't know my way around Green Mountain. And I can still get lost out there. And that was always frustrating, to be running Code 3 in Green Mountain with your lights and siren going and discover you've gone into a cul-de-sac.
Yes.
That's always embarrassing. But it happened. It truly did.
I think in the Recruit Academy, one of the funny stories that we learned when they talked to us about geography was the story of the agent who was working midnights, and he was on patrol and he ran across a Denver car, and the Denver officer pulled up and asked him how he was doing and how his night was going, and then asked him if he knew where he was at. And Sheridan was the dividing line essentially between Denver and Lakewood, and this officer was patrolling in the vicinity of Federal Boulevard. So he'd gone a ways outside his jurisdiction.
And
so
the funny part, it wasn't an agent, it happened to be a sergeant.
Is he at this table?
No. But you found your way home, right?
I did. But dressed very nicely.
One of the other interesting growing pains was that at the beginning you had taxi radios rather than police radios. And one of you pointed out you had to be really different, and using taxi radios, I guess. What were some of the problems that resulted from that? You couldn't talk to each other.
I don't think it was a desire to be different as much as it was just having created a police department overnight. You can't just go buy these radios off the shelf. In fact, our dispatch console at that time was the little box that you sometimes see that is a single speaker or a single microphone box sitting over there, and I think it was just more necessity than anything else. And I think we'll get into that, I'm sure, later on. But one of the reasons some of the early experiments of Lakewood I don't think worked out was because our staffing was so low. Mm-hmm. At that time, I think when I was hired, we had like 28 officers on the street. We had an academy in progress, but for 90,000 people, that was way understaffed by anybody's standard, and we didn't have time to really implement some of the ideas that were going on, like the community policing concepts.
It's a good point, Clint. I remember working graveyards here with the night shift, and we'd have 3 cars per side. We'd have 3 on the east and 3 on the west, and maybe 1 sergeant. We had 7 cars out there, and you just ran call to call to call pretty much all night long. It was very hard to get around to team policing or community policing.
And so all of those officers in the training class couldn't do anything until they graduated. So there was a bit of a delay there. Mm-hmm. All right.
Which I think, Ed, is one of the big assets of having officers recruited from all over the United States who brought experience in here with them and had done policing elsewhere and knew that there were other ways of doing things beside just the Lakewood way. Sometimes the Lakewood way was best, and sometimes something that someone brought in from Georgia or Texas or New Jersey actually worked better.
Yeah.
So those people helped us become a better department too.
So it was really important in the department during that time to try out some of these new things, see what worked, what didn't work, what needed to be changed.
We actually, in the early days of Lakewood, and this is, I think, unheard of for a department that size, had a research and development division where we actually tried all kinds of new things, including radios.
The two gentlemen in front of me here, Chief Patterson, who came in '76, and Chief Brennan, you came in '77, and you have been universally identified as being among the leaders of the practical jokes. And I guess during this period there was a lot of that going on.
Well, hopefully there still are. I think the thing that I always enjoyed about Lakewood when I started was the department had a sense of humor. And frankly, it was a fun place to work. Dan and I were involved in our practical jokes going back and forth, but I got to tell you, it was department-wide. And Mr. Brooks was not a practical joker. And, you know, but we would, like Clint was talking about his green felt tip pen, I remember signing a note one time and giving it to a particular young sergeant and said, "See me Monday morning, PRB." And he goes down, he's sitting in Brooks's office for an hour before the secretary finally realizes he's not there for a meeting, and he's been had. But it really started at the top. I think Chief Johnston, when he was here, the most enduring quality about Chief Johnston was he could laugh at himself. And I think that's true of most of the people there. The practical jokes, for the most part, were very sophomoric. They were spontaneous. You know, you disconnect someone's phone, you put fingerprint powder on the phone. I remember taking the legs off Clint's desk one time up in investigations. I mean, it went on, it was constant. And in fact, the motto of the Lakewood Police Department there then was, "You're not even until you went ahead." I mean, and that was pretty much the way it worked, yeah.
You are the victim of the legs being removed from the table, is that right?
That was one of the jokes.
And I'm told that your reaction was priceless. Tell us what you did.
Well, I didn't want to let him get one up on me, so I pretended that they were just like a normal desk, and I just went about my regular paperwork that morning with the desk a little shorter than it was.
So you sat down on the floor?
That's right. Well, no, my chair was up there, but my desk was way low.
How long did that go on?
I don't know, a couple of hours, I suppose. But I think part of the thing about the humor was, too, there was a lot of stress on the department. I think there was stress because we were overworked and we had long hours. I think there was stress because of the community issues that were going on at the time. I think there was stress because there was expectations were very, very high on everybody. They expect you to be promoted and to move up, as we talked about before. And one of the ways of relieving that stress, I think, was the humor. Mm-hmm. And it went right to not to Pierce Brooks, but everyone else. That captains were engaged in a lot of joke playing back and forth as well.
That was a good thing in the organization. You know, until actually I had the opportunity to work for John in professional standards, and Clint was the lieutenant there. You know, I took my job pretty seriously. You know, you were learning the job. There was a lot going on. There was a lot of stress in the organization, and being around John for just a week just loosened me up completely. I mean, John's philosophy was to have fun, and he didn't have a problem, you know, having fun at your expense. So you had to learn how to respond to that. And over the years, you know, there were a lot of activities like that took place, but the enduring quality, I think the telling quality was, it wasn't just within a rank of people. Chief Johnston was a notorious practical joker, as was Ron Beckham and a lot of the other staff people that we worked with, and you always had to be on your toes when you were working for some of these folks, because you never knew where it was coming from sometimes.
Okay, I'm going to have to do some arm twisting here, obviously, and it gets you to give me some specifics.
All right, I'll tell you. Al Youngs was Al at the time was a lieutenant, and Al was one of these guys. He's outside the box. He's very disorganized. Well, Al had some transmission work done on his automobile, and he was bragging about how well his car was running. Well, Al was just plain cheap, and several detectives went down, and we put concrete blocks under his car. So the rear tires were just barely off the ground. Well, here comes Al. We're all sitting up there looking out the window, watching Al come out to his car. He gets in, fires it up, and you can see him put it in gear. Well, nothing happens, and he is revving that thing up. Those tires are going about 1,000 miles an hour. We go, oh my God, if that thing comes off those blocks, Al's across the street at 100 miles an hour. And I don't think Al ever did figure it out. He finally got up, came back upstairs, and called the transmission shop to give them the dickens for his car not working.
While somebody snuck outside.
Yeah, exactly. But
John did another one one time. It was right when I went up to Internal Affairs, and we had a Deputy Chief, Jim Odell. He was a mountain of a man, big guy, boxer, very, much like Pierce Brooks, a pretty serious individual. And I was walking down the hallway one day, and Jim's got on a white Oxford shirt, and he's a big muscular guy, and he's got this black on his shirt. And John had gone into his office and had taken fingerprint powder and put it on his black phone. We had black phones in those days, and so Jim had been on the phone, had no idea at all that he had this on. When he found out, you could hear him bellow, "Patterson." I mean, it just echoed throughout the building. He knew immediately who had done this.
kill me.
Well, I come into work one day, and one of my fellow detectives finds his desk in the men's restroom. Somebody had taken the time to completely disassemble his desk, move it to the men's restroom, put the chair in there, put the phone in there. We didn't have computers then, but his entire workstation was rearranged in the men's restroom. I think the suspect might be at the table, but it's never been proven.
Is the victim at the table as
well? No, the victim's not here.
And Dan's right. The practical jokes went across ranks because we had a sergeant one night who also has gone on to be a chief, but had gotten in a traffic accident, minor traffic accident in the middle of the night, probably his fault, but very minor. And Al Youngs, captain at the time, calls and has he'd work graveyards, so has the babysitter wake him up. He calls as Attorney Barney Lefkowitz and wants to arrange for an immediate settlement of this accident. And he says, I'll come right over. He says, I'm in your neighborhood. I'll just come right over. And the poor sergeant, who had been woken from a deep sleep, was stuck trying to convince this attorney not to come over.
Trying to figure out how this attorney got his home address and his home phone number, which we as police officers try to protect so much,
yes.
Only to find out later that he'd been had. I worked with him that night. He hadn't slept all day, and he was still angry when he came into work that night that he had been had.
One of my favorite stories from the book, and let's see if any one of you want to relate more details about this, was that one of the officers got into his car and looked in the rearview mirror and saw bullet holes, or what he thought was bullet holes. I'm seeing some gleams in eyes here. Do you want to pick up the story from there?
Pass that over to Clint.
We had, like we said, most people had a really good sense of humor, but there were a couple of the officers that just wasn't a practical joker and never told a joke. Well, one of these officers was Sid Klein, who later became chief in Florida. And Sid was in charge of the intelligence unit. And our intelligence unit always had a reputation. He was extremely straight-laced. They were kind of apart from the rest of the department. They took their jobs very seriously, and Sid certainly took his job very seriously. Organized crime was a real thing back in the 70s in Lakewood. Well, his car was an unmarked car and was parked out back. It had the same parking space. Someone had taken these stenciled bullet holes that you can put on glass and they look like a real, and put them on his back window. And then we all proceeded to peek out the window while he came out, got in his car, put it in reverse, and then happened to look in his rearview mirror, turned his head over and saw the bullet holes. He jumped down, he threw himself down in the seat, came up and started peeking around, seeing if he could see anybody look, or he got out and went back there and realized he'd been had.
Pulled his gun, I understand,
That's
according
right.
to the book.
He realized he'd been had. But the funniest part about it was he never mentioned a word. He knew he'd been had, but he didn't want to say anything because he didn't want someone to realize he'd been the subject of that joke.
One of the interesting characteristics of all these stories, and you've mentioned it, is that half the police force happened to be looking out the window when all of this was going on. So there was some semblance of organization to it, I'm sure.
It's no fun without an audience.
That's right.
Well, we would be remiss if we went on without telling the badge story, which I think is really funny, and we'll see if any of you want to pick up on that, where it was the blue blazers and the old uniform was done away with, and so they needed a relief badge rather than a flat one. Does anybody remember that story? You want to tell it? The chief, anyway, rejected the new badges. Go ahead.
We had flat badges, and they ran out of those fairly early. So a lot of the officers didn't have, or agents didn't have a badge of any kind. So we decided we needed a badge. And finally, Pierce Brooks agreed that we could have a badge. And we were all thrilled. We really were looking forward to this. But we couldn't just go buy a stock badge like every other police department in the United States. They have a multitude of badges that you can customize with different ribbons and so on. But they're all stock. So he contracted with a local badge manufacturer, or a national badge manufacturer, to make a unique badge for Lakewood. And I remember seeing the mock-up drawings of it, and everybody was looking forward to it. They finally picked the badge that they wanted. They finally put the order in, and it took months and months. And everybody is just, I can't wait till the badges get here. And finally, the word went around the department, the badges are here, and we're all excited. And the next news was, the first one out of the box, Pierce looked at and said, I don't think I like these, send them back. And then he wound up buying stock badges, but the manufacturer was so upset that they'd put all this time and effort and manufacture these, and they were rejected, that they actually put them for sale in the Denver Post. And actually, I happened to be purchased one of those badges.
And what did you get, and how much did you have to pay?
You know, I don't remember what they cost. They weren't very much, but I do know that each rank that went up there cost a little more, and I could only afford an agent badge.
So if you wanted to be a chief, you had to pay a little bit more.
That's right.
Well, our time is going fast, and let's get back to a couple of the serious subjects. One of the, in the conversations that I had with all of you, one of the discussions that I had was about the pros and cons of civil service authorities and unions and so on. And some of you spoke very positively about having organizations, and some of you weren't too complimentary. So that's one of the things that I'm going to throw this at you, and then we'll start the discussion from there. And I hope that this is fair. But one of the things that I read or heard was that you have fired more officers, or as many officers, in Lakewood because of misconduct or because they haven't matched the standards as Denver has over a period of time, and yet Denver is a much larger department. And this is an observation on my part, which you can object to, but one of the reasons for that would be that you are not constrained by the professional organizations that constrain other departments.
That's true.
Is that fair?
Yeah, we do not have the constraints. We do not have a collective bargaining agreement with our employees. There isn't a civil service or any type of police commission that oversees the conduct of our employees, and particularly in terms of discipline of the employees, which I really think puts a tremendous responsibility on the leadership and the management of the Lakewood Police Department. And that's been part of the legacy of Lakewood that I've inherited as a police chief. And I think when you don't have those sorts of things, you feel a greater sense of commitment, not only to the employees, but also to the organization and the profession. So I don't have the same constraints or the same types of hurdles that I have to jump through as maybe some other similar larger agencies might have to. In terms of my ability to get rid of people that don't fit into the agency, I can do that in a much more efficient manner than say a larger agency could.
You know, the other thing though too that struck me when I started here in '77, and I think it's still the case today, and I think it's something that we've all taken, you know, into our new organizations as chiefs, is that core value of integrity. It was drilled into you very, very early on in your career here that you could be forgiven for doing a lot of things, and you might be disciplined, there might be corrective actions taken. But if you lied, you know, if you cheated, you know, if you stole, you were going to be terminated. And there were no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I saw people very early on in my career and throughout my career that you know, didn't have the you know, the courage maybe to say what was the right thing to say or to tell the truth, and they lost their jobs. Not that they were bad people, but they weren't the type of people that this organization wanted. And that value, I think, still resonates in this organization today, where in other organizations you hear the community say, why do we still have these officers here? These officers lied. Why are they just being disciplined? Why aren't they being terminated? Because integrity is really, you know, that connection between us and the public. It's what creates that public trust.
I think one of the things that speaks to the culture of Lakewood is that I'm not sure that the officers, the agents, would have it any other way. They really have never had any strong desire for collective bargaining. They don't want to work with people that don't have high standards and the highest in integrity. And I think that's one of the reasons that it works so well.
Okay, equal time. Chief Gardner, you have a union shop up in Greeley.
And I take a little bit different take on this, I think. I think Lakewood would be the excellent department it is, whether it had a extremely militaristic collective bargaining union or not. I think sometimes in some agencies, the leadership uses their union as an excuse not to do the right thing. And I think Lakewood would be doing the right thing if they had a strong union or not. The key is, and I think John Camper nailed it very accurately, is the peer pressure from your employees. What kind of system have they been raised in? And early on at Lakewood, it started, we want people who are going to do the right thing for the right reasons, that they're going to be honest and have integrity. I think that would hold true whether you had a very strong union here or not. So I think to lay it off on a union is a false trail to go down. The key is that the leadership has the courage, as Kevin Paletta does, to do the right thing when you need to ease somebody out of the department. Dan nails it right on the head as well, with there's mistakes of the head, which we can always forgive, there's mistakes of the heart. And I know that the rest of us who run departments today operate the same way, and I think that's where we got it, was at Lakewood, that you lie, you do things deliberately wrong, and you can't stay with us. And Lakewood has always done that, and I think it's what it's taught the rest of us.
You made a very interesting comment to me, and that is that speaking generally, there are two kinds of police unions, one that worry about the work rules and the salaries, and the other that worry about the integrity issues that you've mentioned, and you're fortunate in Greeley.
I think there are union members who occasionally act like cops, and there are cops who occasionally act like union members. And I think those of us, that have worked with unions so far have been fortunate to have the good kind, that they're cops most of the time, they just happen to be a union member as well. But Lakewood has certainly done it the right way as far as the integrity that's expected.
So that's where the legacy comes into play.
Yes.
Is you don't have a civil service authority, or you don't have a union that's pushing, keeping their eyes open and what have you. You have to do it on your own, based on your own legacy and your own set of standards. Chief Paletta, let me come back to you and respond to your comment. What it really means is that the chief has to take all the responsibility for what the union normally would demand in a collective bargaining atmosphere. That's, as you said, that's a lot of burden on the chief.
That's true. To the extent possible as a police chief, and I'm sure all the chiefs at this table feel that way, when you're dealing with a personnel issue, you try to look at it from many perspectives. What does the community think of this situation? What does the organization expect me to do in this situation? What's the right thing to do in this situation? And then you try to look at it from the employee's perspective. What was the employee thinking when they did this situation or did this incident? And what's the appropriate level of discipline? And I really think if you have a strong collective bargaining, or even a better way to say that is a strong discipline policy, it's very easy for a chief to say, well, if you do X, then you get this consequence. But when you have a more open perspective, you actually feel a greater responsibility to make sure that you are doing the right thing and that you have analyzed employee performance from a multitude of angles before you render discipline.
You all talked about the difficulties that were created by the blue blazer uniform and by the college degree requirement and all of that. And some of you indicated to me that really the problem wasn't completely resolved with the other metro area police departments until two important events, and let's talk about each of them. The Columbine shootings in 1999, when so many police departments were asked to participate, and you were to a large degree working side by side. And then the Democratic Convention in 2008, same thing. You worked side by side and all of you contributed. So give me a little bit of commentary on did that enhance the reputation of the Lakewood officers and kind of eliminate the stigma that we talked about earlier?
I think before Columbine happened, that was already taken place. And I think it started in investigations. I know when I was in investigations in the mid-1980s, working in the burglary team as a detective, that there was a lot of inner communication and face-to-face communication between Denver's burglary detectives and ours. We made some great cases. We had some great detectives, Jim Walton, Toby Mays, Fred Johnston, that had great relationships with detectives over there, and that helped. Our tactical team, our SWAT team, had started interacting with Littleton. We were on training schedule with them to where we trained with them on a pretty frequent basis. And then Columbine hit. And when Columbine hit, you had 5 SWAT teams that were there. Obviously Jefferson County, because Columbine was in the unincorporated part of the county. Denver SWAT team was there, Littleton, Arapahoe County, and Lakewood were there. And it really, I'm not going to say that it forced us, because being there as a commander, all of those teams merged together and did what we needed to do to get that situation resolved. And there were no egos involved. It was all about what can we do to resolve this and resolve it safely and try to save as many lives as we could at that time.
Columbine brought about a national change in in the way that you react to those kinds of situations. And my understanding is that it's affected virtually all of the departments in the country. Let's talk about that a little bit. What changed as a result of Columbine in law enforcement and police work?
Well, it was a paradigm shift, Ed. When Columbine happened, you know, there were standard ways to respond to those kinds of situations, and they were essentially viewed as barricaded gunman situations. You responded, you set up your perimeter, you started negotiations, and you made an effort to resolve that situation without the use of force. The paradigm shift is multifaceted. First of all, it's changed the tactics that not only our SWAT teams use, but also our police officers, you know, in terms of responding to active shooter situations. And that dynamic was a pretty significant shift, I think, in regards, from a tactics perspective, in regards to how we respond. The other thing that changed was a communications piece of this. We had a difficult time communicating with over 5 jurisdictions down there from a radio perspective. You literally had to have somebody from Denver, Lakewood, Littleton, Arapahoe County, and Jeffco all standing there with their radios, you know, to communicate. So radio communications has changed significantly, allowing agencies, multiple agencies, to talk about operational situations on one particular channel. The other dynamic that changed there too is we didn't have the ability to communicate with the officers that were actually inside the building. You know, the 800 megahertz radio system, which was the new radio system for public safety, didn't have the capability to penetrate concrete and steel buildings. So as a result, there have been considerable technology changes that have been made there that allow us to communicate. And then the other dynamic, I think, that's really shifted for police departments, for schools, and for students is the whole perspective of safety and expectations. Police departments have a different expectation on us today when we respond to active shooter situations. The public has a different expectation of schools in regards to preparing for these kinds of emergency situations. And I think the other dynamic that really changed was through the 1990s, as communities, we thought our schools were safe. We thought they were safe places to be. And that dynamic's changed for students, it's changed for the school and the administration, and it's certainly changed for police departments as well.
Have the experiences learned at Columbine impacted any of you others in terms of your departments?
Oh, absolutely. It's the lessons that came out of Columbine have changed law enforcement internationally, not just in this country, on how you respond to that type of situation. It was a terribly, terribly painful lesson, but we learned an awful lot from it. And we all do things differently now.
Yeah.
And I would say, just echo the same things that Chief Brennan has said, that the whole communications issue, interoperability, has been a big deal, and of course the training and the expectations of schools, and schools becoming much more active themselves in dealing with what are they going to do to address these kinds of emergency situations.
Chief Gardner, you're a prolific author. You've written a number of books on law enforcement, and specifically what I want to ask you is, to what degree has your experience in Lakewood impacted the philosophy that's reflected in a lot of those law enforcement books, how-to books as I understand it?
It's been huge. One of the things that I wrote, which just goes to show you, if you give a monkey a typewriter, he'll eventually spell a word, maybe a dirty word, but he spells one, is called...
You're being modest, but go ahead.
Well, the book is called Police Chief 101, and I say in the book that I'm not a very smart person, but I have known an awful lot of smart persons. And what's in the book is advice on how to be a police chief from people sitting at this table and from other police chiefs that I've talked to in Colorado. In other words, I've stolen all of their expertise and their good ideas and tried to put them into this book. But a huge amount of that stuff comes from people who I've grown up with at Lakewood, that I've known since Lakewood. It helped me a huge amount.
All right, let's come back to our two newest officers over here. Tell me what the Democratic Convention, what impact did that have on the Lakewood Department and your associations with the other departments in the area? Why is that such a big deal for the police departments that were involved in that?
You know, I think if there was any animosity left, and I don't think there was much, as Dan talked about, I think by the 40 years had gone by and I think our agencies were working pretty well together. But if there was any animosity left, I think the DNC put a stake in that, and forever. Thanks to, well, Commander Mike Becker worked very hard with the Denver Police Department and other agencies throughout the Front Range. And in fact, Denver felt comfortable enough with their relationship with Lakewood that they made the decision to handle the policing outside of the venue, and actually turned the venue, the Pepsi Center and Invesco Field, over to the Lakewood Police Department to handle. And I think that speaks a lot to that relationship that developed and changed over the years, and the agencies get along extremely well now, and had a lot of fun doing it too.
And if I could just tag on to that, sure. I think that, as John said, I think that really solidified the partnerships and the relationships, not just with the local agencies, but also with federal agencies that we had never interacted with before. In fact, I think it goes back to Columbine. We were pretty much silos. Each independent agency shared its own resources within itself, but we weren't very good about bridging that gap with other agencies. And I think Columbine taught us that we need to form better partnerships. I think the DNC solidified that. And just speaking it with a timely situation, right now we have a task force gathered in the Lakewood Police Department that consists of 50 people from the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the FBI that are investigating a recent incident that occurred at our Mills Mall. I don't think those situations would have happened 15 years ago. No. You would have had 3 separate agencies trying to work this incident from 3 separate locations. And the other benefit is I know the people that are in that room from my experience at the DNC.
As we get down toward the end of our discussion, let me just throw it open to all of you. We've talked about a lot of things that are distinctive about the Lakewood Police Department and particularly its legacy. What haven't we talked about that you think is important? I know, for example, that when the department was formed in 1970, there really wasn't a lot written down about manuals and how to proceed as a police officer. What were there or was there? And you, the department, made a sizable contribution to that.
Well, when I got here in '73, there was a sizable manual already in existence. But one of the things, and I think Clint can attest to this, as we had all these new ideas coming in, that manual changed daily, it felt like. And you had to revise that thing all the time because we were learning more, we were learning better ways to do things, and it was just a constant state of change. And that was a little hard to keep up with. In fact, some of our early folks decided, you know, I don't need all this change and this is too stressful, and they left. Not everybody who came here in the early days decided this was for them. They didn't stick with it. But the policies and procedures changed a lot, but there was always a lot of them.
You know, one of the things that, just to tag on to what Jerry has to say too, I think one of the hallmarks of this agency in terms of how it views itself is it's always trying to strive towards excellence. And in the early 80s, one of the ways that they did that was by becoming a nationally accredited police department. It's easy to sit back in any police department and say we're one of the best, and we've all been around you know, the nation and interacted with other departments where, you know, their claim to fame is we're one of the best. Well, the way that you prove that is you benchmark yourself against standards and you test yourself. And I think it's a testament to this agency that they've always found ways to do that.
Any other things we haven't talked about? What? Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and it's off topic a little bit, but I think one of the factors that I think is impressive about this agency, and I don't know that you realize how rare it is until you leave, and that is that none of us at this table or any of the other 60-some folks that have gone on to be chiefs were criticized in the least for taking those opportunities. And that's extremely rare. As you go around the country and you talk to others in other agencies, you would not mention to anyone that you're considering putting in for a chief's job. Even in the corporate world, sometimes that's frowned upon. And in this department, I've never heard anybody criticized at all for thinking about going outside the agency and looking at some other opportunity. I think what they recognized is that that could only look good and look positive for Lakewood.
I'm glad you brought this up, because as an illustration in your own story, you actually loaned to Grand Junction by the chief in Lakewood, which illustrates what you've just said.
I was, Ed, and Lakewood had done that on a number of other occasions as well. And in this case, yeah, Kevin, in fact, took a risk by loaning me. Grand Junction was in need of an interim chief for about 6 months, and I went out there in that capacity first before deciding to put in for the permanent position. And Lakewood had done that before, but that's almost unheard of in some agencies because of that risk factor. But Lakewood views that as that can only be positive for Lakewood, to have more of our folks out there influencing other police departments and making a difference nationwide can only look good for Lakewood.
Let me ask the rest of you, to what degree did this attitude on the part of the Lakewood Police Department help you in terms of moving on to your own chief's jobs?
Well, it was huge for me. I think Charlie Johnston encouraged us to do this sort of thing. They trained us as generalists. I mean, we stay in an assignment, like Jerry was saying earlier, 3 to 5 years, and then they moved you to a new assignment. So I think that exposure to all different departments inside the agency was a big help for us in making that transition to become a police chief.
I think that really started at the very beginning, because I can think of people who left in 1970. Craig Camp, who was an agent in charge here, went on to Northglenn in 1970. A couple of the ones left from the very beginning. So that was a culture that started at the very start, saying we're going to help people, we're going to do everything we can to help them through their career, whether it's with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. I think Gray Buckley and a couple of them left early on to do that. But whatever would advance your career, the department has always stood behind them and done everything they could to prepare them for that.
Well, and I think, you know, a viewer might be watching this and thinking, you know, that's really a bad business model, that you would let all your talent leave and go somewhere else. But I think it's precisely because of that business model that we attract so much talent. I think, well, I can speak for myself. I read about Lakewood when I was taking college courses in the 1970s, and I read about the new model in policing, and I read about the professionalism, and I read about the expectations, and thought, that's the agency I want to work for. So it's precisely because of the legacy that we attract people that can step in. Now, had I known John was actually going to take the job in Grand Junction, I wouldn't have made that decision. But no, it's...
Who paid the salary during that loan?
No, they changed that work out awful quick.
The other dynamic, though, that creates, too, is people like us transition. It creates new opportunities inside the organization. So those individuals who are agents or sergeants or commanders or division chiefs, they get the opportunity to move up. And in other organizations where they don't encourage that, it's very static. And it creates a lot of frustration because those that want more challenges can't find them.
I would think, though, that you have to have a mindset that says, well, I'm going to keep this guy for 5 years, and I'm going to maximize what the department gets out of him and then wish him well. Is there an aspect to that?
It's probably longer than 5 years, but there is an aspect that people, or an expectation that people's talent isn't going to just stay at Lakewood, that there is a broader law enforcement profession that's going to benefit from what people learn at Lakewood. And I think the gentlemen at this table are a testament to that.
And next to last question, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up, and I apologize for not bringing it up at the time, but Pierce Brooks was responsible for hiring the first women Lakewood police officers, and that was very important. Talk about that and talk about the adjustment period.
And I think that was particularly tough on the women officers because they were having to prove themselves. And it was a big thing for us when Pierce Brooks finally let them go out on the street by themselves, because for a while they had to work with a male officer all the time. And of course they were pulling at that bit all the time. That didn't feel right. But they had a rough job to do at the start of proving themselves not only to our own officers but to the other jurisdictions we worked with. But Brooks had the courage to go ahead and give that a try. Even beyond and before Brooks, I think the women officers had a tough time because we were even trying to decide what kind of uniform they should wear.
Yeah, and how to carry the gun. That was interesting.
And I can remember early on in the early 70s wearing skirts Not me, you understand. The women officers. I couldn't imagine how hard it was for them to do the job out here on the street wearing those skirts.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Difficult.
Well, let's get down to our last question and kind of wrap it up and summarize here. And Chief Blackhurst, let's begin with you and go around the table. What's your most memorable moment in your service in the Lakewood Police Department, or what is the most important thing you took away from Lakewood that now contributes to what you're doing now?
Well, I gave some thought to that, and I can't come up with any single incident that was most memorable, but I can tell you what Lakewood has meant to me, and what Lakewood has meant to me is, yes, it's always had the ability to train, it's always given me a lot of opportunities, but the most important thing to me has always been the quality of people that I've learned from. My peers and my role models and my supervisors that gave me the inspiration to take a little bit from this person and a little bit from this person, and it's truly made me what I am as a leader, and it's the quality of individuals.
I think and this may sound corny, Ed, but I think the important thing that I take away from Lakewood, what I remember the most strongly about it, has been that I feel like that I've had the chance to help make the leadership careers of some young men and women who are now going on to be leaders in their own organizations, and some of them are here at the table today. But I'd like to think, and hopefully they won't change my mind, that I had something to do with starting them in that direction. I didn't do a thing for Patterson, and he still got trouble.
Thank you, Jerry.
Two things I'd like to mention, Ed. In April of 1979, I had the opportunity to save a woman's life. That was personally very satisfying for me. And then in 1986, I was a unit leader on a team that shut down Colfax Cruising and solved a huge community problem. I will always bleed Lakewood blue. I mean, this is where I had my roots. I'm thoroughly loyal to this police department to this day, but it was a great career for me.
Chief?
You know, Ed, when you'd asked that question when we'd sat down and met before this meeting, I've given a tremendous amount of thought. And I have had the opportunity to be involved in a lot of great calls. You know, and the thing that I've taken away from all of those is, irrespective of rank in the organization, when the bell clangs, you know, when we need to respond to a hostage situation or a shots fired situation or just a normal call for service, the sense of teamwork and camaraderie and the commitment to excellence resonates in this organization, and I think it resonates in all of us as well. And if that's the one thing that I've been able to take away from this organization, that sense of excellence, of doing it right, and take that to the organization that I'm at now, that's what I've taken. The people in this organization are great, irrespective of whether or not they've ever achieved a rank. The people in this organization, you know, are the people that make it great, and that's really the bottom line.
Chief Kemper.
Well, a lot of what these guys said too, and you know, what I was so impressed with throughout my career, again, irrespective of rank, as Dan says, is that you were allowed to influence policy. You were allowed to try some ideas and take part in change in the department. And that's something I don't think people realize how rare that is in any organization, but in police organizations as well. And you know, I know that all of us have been asked many times why Lakewood has produced so many chiefs. And when you think about it, I don't know that it's perhaps such a big secret. You know, you take highly motivated, well-educated individuals, bring them into an organization, allow them to innovate, hold them to extremely high standards, and I don't think it's any surprise that they're going to achieve some great things.
Chief Paletta, wrap it up for us.
And for me, Ed, it's the legacy that I've inherited, the work that's gone before me, and the contributions that these gentlemen have made and many others have made, and I feel a strong sense of responsibility to the organization to maintain and uphold those standards.
Gentlemen, thank you. It's been a fun and an enlightening conversation, and we really have truly celebrated excellence over the last hour, and you are an integral part of it, and thank you very much for coming and sharing with us. And thank you all for watching. I'm Ed Sardella. We'll see you next time.